it feels good to be a chap. A proper chap knows exactly where it's at. A proper chap is a rogue in well-heeled brogues who knows exactly when it's right to wear a hat.
I was a journalist. I worked for The Idler, some newspapers, just general hack really. And what I found was that the stories I was pitching to those magazines and newspapers weren't being taken up. And so in the end I had this huge amount of stories that I wanted to write about, which nobody wanted to publish. So I decided to start my own magazine where I could publish those stories, and that was The Chap. So it was vanity publishing, if you like, which ended up, feeding everyone's vanity. So it worked out quite well. I worked for this little fringe magazine called Cheap Date, a sort of fringe fashion magazine that you won't have heard of, run by a woman called Kira Jolliffe, who was quite an inspiration to me actually. And she was running this thing on a sort of shoestring, and I was the deputy editor, and I would bring in stuff, I'd write things for her. And one day I brought in this knitting pattern of this splendid chap in a crew neck Argyle sweater with a pipe, and he was great. And I said, let's use this in something. And she just said, nah, it wasn't right for her magazine. And that became the front cover of the first issue of The Chap. So, I stored it away somewhere and kept that idea. And so really that guy on that cover came out of him. I wonder who he was. The first issue was only meant to be a bit of a joke, so we photocopied it in a photocopy shop with a colour cover, and I think we had 100 copies. And I didn't just give them to friends, I gave them to journalists that I knew on the big papers, the Evening Standard, the Express, and nearly all of them loved it so much they all ran a feature about it. And I'd also been canny enough to set up a PO box address for subscriptions. But we didn't have any subscriptions. We had no second issue in mind. We had nothing in mind to the future. But suddenly I think we had 700 subscribers overnight after one article in the Daily Telegraph. So we had to do another issue, and then it just grew from there. The thing about The Chap is that we never thought of it as an original idea. We always thought of it as a repackaging of an idea that already existed, but we just packaged it and gave it a name and gave it a focus and gave it a platform. But it's always been there, the idea of the chap, going right back to the early Terry Thomas black and white films from the 40s, maybe even before that, back to sort of early Hollywood films from the 30s. As soon as the magazine became more sort of widespread and visible, we started getting invited to go on all sorts of weird television programs, breakfast shows which were filmed at 5 o'clock in the morning. So it's very strange to be driven by, in the dark to some studio in East London and be suddenly sitting on a sofa with Wayne Hemingway and talking about Blakey's or something like that. That did actually happen. Our moment in the sun, if you like, was when we went on Rich and Judy, which was then a big primetime or early evening show. And they seemed to like us, or they pretended to like us, and they'd gone to a lot of trouble to make up all these little sets and scenarios, which based on our first book. So our book had come out by then. So that was another thing which ramped up the kind of attention we got. We had the Chap Manifesto only in 2001. So the first issue came out in 1999, and then 2001 this book, which was a mass market kind of book. The Chap Manifesto was available everywhere, and I suppose that brought us to much bigger audience. We were always careful to include the ladies because we knew we had lady readers, and in fact they themselves gave themselves a name, which was the Chapette. And it was only when we started doing biggish events that we saw that there were an actual equal amount of women dressing in the chap way, adopting the chap lifestyle, as there were men, which was quite a surprise to us. So we began to devote more and more coverage. In fact, we did a whole issue devoted to the ladies, because we drafted in a lady to edit it for us, because there was so much to say and we felt that they could say it themselves better than we could. So Am I Chap was an idea we had where we realised that we were more than a magazine. We were a kind of pamphlet for a way of life, and a way of life that we hadn't invented. Other people were already living this way of life, and they were merely reading the magazine because it reflected their interests. We did a few events and met some of these people who were self-declared chaps, and then we thought, this sounds a bit mean, we met some of them and they weren't so impressive. Most of them were like goodness me, look at this chap in his tweed suit and his, fur coat, whatever. People were very well dressed and we were very impressed by them. But then occasionally, as we did bigger events, that people would turn up with quite badly put together outfits, maybe stick-on moustaches. But the worst crime for us was always a fake pipe, like a plastic pipe from a fancy dress shop. We realised that it was a very competitive market, whether you were a chap or not, and that people were perfectly willing to submit themselves to a sort of sartorial assessment from us. So that's when we decided to say, am I a chap? And then people would send their pictures in, we would comment on them, and strangely enough, the more critical our assessments were, the more people sent their pictures in. So it became this sort of flood where we couldn't use them all. Of course, there would always still be the people who were actually very well dressed, and we would always make a point of celebrating those. But it was kind of funnier for the readers to see us tear apart someone who was dressed absolutely appallingly, because the readers who did dress well would agree with us. So we were just helping them. We were actually helping them to dress better. And in fact, there was one chap who, when he first sent his picture in, we were not very kind, and I feel bad about that. We were quite ungenerous about his outfit, but he just kept at it. And then in the end, he sent his picture, and we'd forgotten all about him, and he actually ended up being star chap. So we had helped him to sort of improve his dress through the magazine and through our comments. So there's a great success story.
Ikki-tikki tambo, zaza rambo, ba busko boom, paging all athletes for the Chap Olympiad.
The Chap Olympics began with an article called, funnily enough, the Chap Olympics. Our key writers, our best writers were always Torquil Arbuthnot and Nathaniel Slipper. Sadly, Nathaniel's no longer with us. May his soul rest in peace. But he and Torquil would come up with weird ideas, usually a chapist take on something, established, like they did going to university, chap style, becoming an actor, chap style, and then one day they wrote an article doing the Olympics, chap style, the Chap Olympics.
Will this make a difference? It looks like it might. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairs.
And then, very popular article, we loved it, the readers loved it, and so we thought, what would happen if we actually did this? If we turned this article with these weird sports like umbrella jousting, dressing for wrestling, moustache plucking, quill throwing, what would happen if, could you turn those sports into actual physical sports? And of course, you could, and we did. And that's how the Chap Olympics began. The Olympiad started off the idea that not only was there room for us to entertain through physical acts which reflected the content of the magazine, but there were these amazing people who wanted to come to our events who looked great, and we wanted to meet them. And the more events we did, the more the outfits proved. So we began doing the anarcho-dandyist ball once a year, which was, a huge party with cabaret entertainment, and then the burlesque thing started happening, so we didn't get involved in that directly because we thought that was doing its own thing. But the idea of a cabaret, variety entertainment became very popular. Children in Tweed was something which was a bit of a disaster. We did that as a publicity stunt, if I'm honest, but the idea was, we love puns. Who doesn't love a pun? And Children in Tweed, I think it was actually a letter that somebody wrote us, or perhaps, no, somebody wrote a letter saying about Suave the Children, and we thought, well, that's funny. And they made a little logo of the Save the Children logo, but with the child had a pipe. We thought that was funny, and then we thought, well, what about Children in Need, and obviously Tweed? So we actually, in order to research this article, we went to the East End with a van full of tweed, and we went to quite a rough council estate in Tower Hamlets, and we just stood there, and there was children who should have been at school, and we gave them all tweed clothing, and they all put it on, and they posed for photographs. We let them keep the tweed clothing, but unfortunately they helped themselves to a few other things as well, such as the van driver's wallet and someone's phone. But that's the East End for you. We survived. They survived, and they got some nice clothes to wear. When we first started the Chap, the thing we were kind of pushing against was this kind of sportswear, which is of course everywhere now, but then it was quite a new thing. What I don't like about the way men in particular dress now is the way it's so bland. You know, if you go to a typical high street in a typical city in anywhere in the world, but in particular in the UK, you will see a sea of kind of navy blue, dark grey and black. People just, there's no imagination in clothes anymore. It seems to be a very conservative time, which is ironic because people often accused our dress code of being conservative with a very small c, and I would always say to them, well, it's actually less conservative than a room full of men wearing hoodies and, you know, jeans. That's conservative because they all look the same. If you want to stand out, it actually takes courage, and it takes a bit of edge to stand out. So it's funny how the so-called conservative traditional clothing of the past is now the eccentric weird clothing of the present. Things that we never got round to doing, which we'd like to have done. I mean, I wouldn't have mind doing one of these sort of things that Ranulph Fiennes does, where, you know, you walk to the North Pole wearing tweed or something like that. I'd like to. There was an experiment, I believe, which he was involved in, where they looked at the clothing that Mallory wore, George Mallory wore to climb Everest, and they compared its weight. Well, they didn't look. They actually had the clothing. They found it, didn't they, on his corpse? They weighed the clothes and found that it weighed slightly less than all the modern mountaineering equipment. I suppose I'd like to have got involved in something a bit more scientific, you know, where we actually prove that there's scientific evidence that being a chap is better than not being a chap.